April 5th, 1242. The most feared warriors in Europe are drowning in a frozen lake. Metal armor drags them down into the icy waters. Knights who have never known defeat now struggle uselessly against the ice breaking beneath their feet. How did the invincible Teutonic knights become helpless victims? The answer lies with a Russian prince who turned frozen water into a weapon of mass destruction. But to understand how this happened, we must first meet the terror marching toward Russia. In the first decades of the 13th century, a relentless force swept through the Baltic like a storm of iron and fire. The Teutonic Knights, also known as the Livonian Order, were not just soldiers. They were a Catholic military order that combined religious fanaticism with the most advanced medieval warfare technology. Each knight was a walking fortress, protected by up to 88 pounds of plate armor that made them practically invulnerable in close combat. Their swords were the best in Europe. Their war-trained horses trampled any infantry line that dared to resist. This was no ordinary force. It was a machine of conquest backed by the Pope's authority, funded by Europe's wealthiest kingdoms, and trained from childhood for a single mission: to expand the Catholic world eastward, converting or annihilating everything in its path. The Baltic Crusades had already lasted for decades. Territory after territory fell. Estonia, Latvia. Entire regions that once housed pagan peoples or Orthodox Christians now trembled under Germanic rule. The Teutonic Order didn't just fight battles. It executed systematic campaigns of conquest. Cities were besieged with military precision. Populations were subjugated with brutal efficiency. Resistance was crushed without hesitation. The numbers were terrifying. At the height of its Baltic campaigns, the Order could mobilize around 20,000 men, including heavy knights, men-at-arms, mercenaries, and auxiliary troops recruited from conquered territories. This force didn't just outnumber most of its enemies, it dominated them with superior technology. The heavy Teutonic cavalry formations crushed enemy lines like a hammer smashing glass. Teutonic military doctrine was simple and devastating. A massive frontal charge of heavy cavalry, supported by archers and infantry. The combined weight of hundreds of knights in full armor, advancing in tight formation, created an impact force that few medieval defenses could withstand. Shield walls shattered. Spear formations snapped. The ground shook under the horses' hooves, and the air echoed with the metallic crash of armor colliding with flesh and bone. But the power of the Teutonic Knights wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The mere sight of their ranks advancing, black and white banners fluttering in the wind, was enough to break the morale of entire armies before the first spear was thrown. They represented not just a military threat, but an almost supernatural force, a visible manifestation of divine wrath in the name of Catholic Christendom. Victory after victory cemented this reputation. In 1236, the Teutonics crushed the Livonian pagans at the Battle of Saul. In 1237, they absorbed the remnants of the Order of the Brothers of the Sword, further expanding their dominion. Fortresses that had resisted for generations fell in weeks. Noble lineages that had ruled for centuries were wiped out in a single bloody afternoon. And now, in the spring of 1242, this war machine had set its sights on the Novgorod Republic. Novgorod was one of medieval Russia's oldest and proudest city-states. Rich in trade, powerful in influence, orthodox in faith. But militarily, it was vulnerable. Its resources were limited compared to the Teutonic Order's vast coffers. Its troops were composed mainly of light infantry and irregular cavalry, nothing that could face the approaching storm of steel. Novgorod's walls were strong, but Teutonic sieges had brought down even more powerful defenses. Prince Alexander Nevsky knew this. Alexander Yaroslavich, known as Nevsky after his victorious defense against the Swedes on the banks of the Neva River in 1240, was a commander of just 22 years. Young, but already marked by battle scars and the crushing responsibility of defending Russian Orthodox territories against Catholic invaders from the west and Mongols from the east. He was not just a warrior. He was a natural strategist, someone who understood that war was not won with courage alone, but with intelligence and manipulation of the battlefield. But even for Nevsky, the situation was desperate. His scouts' reports painted a grim picture. The Teutonics were advancing through the border region between modern Estonia and Russia, absorbing small garrisons, burning villages, consolidating control. The direction of the march was clear. They were coming for Novgorod, and when they arrived, they would bring 20,000 men against the much smaller forces Nevsky could muster. Maybe 5,000, maybe 12,000, depending on how much time he had to summon militias. But even in the best-case scenario, his soldiers would be outmatched in equipment, training, and organized ferocity. Facing the Teutonics in open field would be suicide. Their heavy cavalry charges would shatter any Russian infantry line in minutes. Retreating behind Novgorod's walls would mean a prolonged siege, something the city might not withstand. The Teutonics were masters of siege warfare. They had time, resources, and the fanatical patience of crusaders determined to spread their faith. Nevsky needed an advantage, something the Teutonics wouldn't expect, something that would turn their superiority into vulnerability. And that was when his eyes landed on Lake Peipus. Peipus, or Peipsi as it was locally known, was a vast lake marking the natural border between Russian territories and the lands conquered by the Teutonics. In winter, it froze completely, transforming into an icy plain stretching for miles. But now it was early April. Spring was coming. Ice still covered the lake's surface, but for how long? And more importantly, how strong was it still? Nevsky began asking questions. He consulted local fishermen who knew the lake in all seasons. He talked to hunters who crossed the ice in winter. He studied weather patterns and water behavior when temperatures rose. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. The ice was melting. Not completely. Not yet. But with every sunny day, every night where the temperature didn't drop enough to fully refreeze the surface, the ice grew weaker, thinner in some spots, more vulnerable to concentrated pressure. And the Teutonic Knights, with their 40-kilo armor, their war horses, their dense formations, and their crushing charges, represented exactly the kind of pressure the weakened ice could not withstand. Nevsky visualized the scene. Hundreds of knights in full armor, galloping in tight formation over a frozen surface that looked solid, but hid a deadly weakness just beneath. The concentrated weight of a cavalry charge, the vibration, the impact, and then the inevitable. The ice cracking, the freezing water swallowing men and horses, armor transforming from protection into anchors dragging them to the bottom. But knowing the ice was weak was only half the plan. The real challenge was getting the Teutonics to step onto it. And heavy knights don't charge onto unfavorable terrain unless they believe they are winning. Nevsky would have to deceive them. He would have to position his forces to look vulnerable, enticing, easy to crush. He would have to convince experienced and arrogant commanders that a charge across the frozen lake was the path to quick victory. He would have to turn the Teutonics' greatest strength, their devastating heavy cavalry, into the very weapon of their destruction. He studied the terrain around Lake Peipus. There were low hills on the banks, covered in sparse vegetation and remnant snow. Places where troops could hide. Positions from which Russian forces could appear suddenly, flanking an enemy already in despair on the brittle ice. Nevsky's mind worked the problem from every angle. He needed to control where the battle would happen. He needed to ensure the Teutonics attacked exactly where he wanted. He needed to time the deception perfectly. And above all, he needed the plan to look natural, not like an obvious trap that seasoned commanders would recognize immediately. It was an audacious plan, dangerous. It depended on dozens of variables outside his control. The weather could cool down and refreeze the lake completely. The Teutonics might choose a different path. They might suspect the trap. They might simply refuse combat and besiege Novgorod anyway. But it was the only chance Novgorod had. Nevsky gathered his commanders. He explained the plan. Some looked at him as if he had gone mad. Use the lake as a weapon? Bet the city's survival on melting ice? Trust that the enemy would be arrogant enough to fall for the trap? It seemed impossible, but Nevsky wasn't asking for opinions. He was giving orders. The Russian forces began to position themselves. Detachments were sent to the hills around the lake, hidden from view, ready to flank at the critical moment. The main line would be positioned on the edge of the ice, seemingly retreating, seemingly disorganized, seemingly vulnerable. The perfect bait for a cavalry charge that wouldn't be able to resist such a tempting target. And while his men moved into position, Nevsky stood on the shore of Lake Peipus, watching the frozen surface. Sunlight reflected off the ice, creating a deceptive sheen of solidity. But he knew the truth. He knew that beneath that seemingly firm surface, destruction awaited. And he knew that the Teutonic knights, confident in their invincibility, in their impenetrable armor, and their countless victories, wouldn't see the danger until it was too late. Prince Alexander Nevsky was about to turn a lake into a battlefield, and then into a graveyard. But first, he needed to convince the most feared warriors in Europe to step onto the ice, and for that, he would have to use the most powerful weapon of all, the enemy's arrogance. What happens when you trick an entire army into believing they are winning? What happens when you turn their greatest strength into their greatest weakness? Nevsky was about to find out, and the answer would change the fate of Russia forever. The next morning, Alexander Nevsky wasn't in the war room. He wasn't meeting with his commanders. He was standing on the shore of Lake Peipus, watching. Just watching. The frozen surface stretched out before him like an infinite white desert. The spring sun reflected off the ice, creating a deceptive shimmer. It looked solid. It looked firm. It looked safe. But Nevsky knew that appearances lie. And that morning, he was betting the survival of Novgorod on it. He brought with him men who knew that lake better than any general ever could. Fishermen. Men who spent their winters cutting holes in the ice, measuring its thickness, observing when it was safe to walk and when it was suicide to try. Men whose lives depended on understanding ice. And they began to speak. Nevsky listened to every word as if it were a divine revelation. Because that is exactly what it was. A revelation. The difference between life and death. The fisherman explained how the ice behaves in spring, how the April sun melts the surface during the day, how water seeps through the cracks, weakening the layers underneath, how it looks safe from above, but is rotten on the inside, how it can support the weight of a man walking, but not 20 men running together, and certainly not 400 armored knights galloping in formation. Nevsky asked questions, many questions. How thick is it right now? Where is the ice thinnest? How does the weight distribute? What happens when too much pressure is applied to a single point? And as the answers came, an idea began to form. Not an ordinary idea. An impossible idea. A brilliant idea. An idea that would make the ice the grave of the Teutonic Order. Nevsky returned to the city. He summoned his commanders. And he began to explain. But this time, he wasn't asking for opinions. He was teaching physics. The physics of war. The physics of destruction. He grabbed paper and started drawing. A Teutonic knight's armor weighed between 30 and 40 kilos. The sword, the shield, the lance, another 5 to 10 kilos. The war horse, fully equipped, weighed between 500 and 600 kilos. Add it all up. A single armored knight and his mount represented over 400 pounds of concentrated weight. Now multiply that by 400 knights. Then add the men-at-arms, the auxiliaries, the servants who follow the army. You have over 20,000 men pressing down on the ice at the same time. But it wasn't just about weight. It was about physics, about pressure distribution. A walking man spreads his weight through his feet. A horse at a normal pace distributes the weight across 4 legs. But a cavalry charge concentrates all the weight in forward motion. The horses gallop, all together, in formation. All that weight hitting the ice at the same time. Like a hammer, like a controlled earthquake, like taking a mountain and throwing it against an already cracked surface. Nevsky's commanders looked at him. Some began to understand, others still seemed skeptical. So he continued. Lake Peipus wasn't uniform. There were sections where the water was deeper. Sections where underground currents kept the ice thinner. Sections where the sun hit for longer during the day, accelerating the melting. And Nevsky had mapped every one of these sections. With the help of the fishermen. With meticulous observation. With the precision of an engineer planning a bridge. Except Nevsky wasn't planning to build a bridge. He was planning to destroy one. He pointed to the map. Here. This specific section. The water is deeper. The ice is thinner. The currents keep the temperature higher. And this is exactly where the Teutonic Knights needed to step. But how to convince them? How do you make an entire army, confident in its invincibility, march exactly where you want them to? Simple. You give them what they want, an easy victory, a vulnerable target, prey that seems to be fleeing. Nevsky explained the second part of the plan. The Russian forces would position themselves on the edge of the lake, but not in battle formation, not in solid defense, in apparent disarray, as if they were retreating, as if they were afraid, as if they were ready to break and run, the perfect bait for heavy cavalry. Because knights cannot resist a fleeing enemy. It's against their nature. It's against all their training. You see an enemy retreating, you charge, you crush, you conquer. It's what they were bred to do. And when the Teutonic knights saw that vulnerable Russian line on the edge of the ice, they would do exactly what Nevsky expected. They would charge, all together, in close formation, because that's how heavy cavalry works. Concentrated force, maximum impact, absolute terror. Except this time, the terror would be theirs. But there was more. Because Nevsky wasn't betting everything on the ice breaking. He was creating layers of destruction. He was planning a trap within a trap. While the main Russian line lured the knights toward the lake, additional forces would remain hidden in the surrounding hills. Completely out of sight. Waiting. Watching. Ready to strike from the flanks at the exact moment. When the ice began to crack. When chaos took over. When the knights were disoriented, desperate, sinking. That is the moment you attack from the sides. That is the moment you turn defeat into a massacre. And it was right here, while explaining this final layer of his plan, that Alexander Nevsky revealed the true genius of his strategy. The Teutonic Knights' greatest strength was their armor, those metal plates that made them virtually unstoppable in land combat. Those same plates that could shrug off arrows, swords, and spears. Those same plates that made them the most feared warriors in Europe. But Nevsky saw something the knights didn't. Their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Because armor that protects you on land becomes a death trap in water. Armor that makes you invulnerable in combat turns into an anchor the moment the ground beneath your feet disappears. 66 pounds of metal strapped to your body. You can't swim. You can't float. You can't move. The freezing water of Lake Peipus is barely above 35 degrees Fahrenheit. You have seconds before hypothermia kicks in. You have minutes before you die. And if you're wearing full-plate armor, you have less than a minute. You sink like a stone. And you die, drowned, frozen, trapped inside the very protection that was supposed to save you. Nevsky turned the knights' technological advantage into a death sentence, making their greatest strength the cause of their ruin. And as he explained this to his commanders, as he showed how every piece fit together, as he revealed how he would use physics, psychology, and terrain as weapons, the expression on the men's faces changed. It wasn't skepticism anymore. It was admiration. It was fear. It was the realization that they were standing before a military genius, a man who didn't just fight wars, but recreated them, a man who turned nature into an ally and enemies into victims of their own arrogance. But knowing the ice would break wasn't enough. Planning the trap wasn't enough. Now came the hardest part. Execution. And executing meant making the Teutonic Knights believe they were winning while they marched straight to their deaths. The days that followed were of meticulous preparation. Nevsky sent scouts to map enemy positions. He sent detachments to the hills surrounding Lake Peipus, hiding them in forests, behind rock formations, anywhere they couldn't be seen from the lake. He positioned his main forces at the edge of the ice, but trained them to look weak, to look disorganized, to look vulnerable. Because the key to the whole operation was convincing the knights they had an overwhelming advantage. And while the Russian forces moved into position, Nevsky kept studying the weather, watching the temperature, feeling the wind, analyzing the sun. Because timing was everything. Too early, and the ice would be too strong. Too late, and the knights might suspect. But at the right moment, at the perfect moment, when the ice looked solid but was rotten on the inside, when the knights were too confident to question. That was the moment, and that moment was coming. April 5th, 1242. The date was chosen with surgical precision. It wasn't chance, it wasn't luck, it was science, it was observation, it was Nevsky transforming knowledge into power. The spring sun had done its work, the ice had weakened, but it still looked safe. It still shone under the morning light as if it were invincible, as if it could withstand anything. Exactly as the Teutonic Knights believed about themselves. The trap was set. The forces were in position. The stage was set. Now all that was missing was the audience. And on the other side of the lake, the Teutonic knights were preparing, donning their armor, sharpening their swords, feeding their horses, confident, certain of victory, certain that in a few hours Novgorod would be theirs, certain that no force on earth could stop them. They didn't know they were about to step onto a lake that had been turned into a weapon. They didn't know that every step they took on that ice would be calculated. They didn't know that the man on the other side of the battlefield had studied physics, had consulted fishermen, had mapped every inch of terrain, had planned every detail with the precision of a watchmaker building a mechanism of destruction. The Teutonic knights saw a battle. Alexander Nevsky saw an execution. And when dawn broke, when the sunlight began to illuminate Lake Peipus, when the two forces saw each other for the first time across that vast expanse of ice, everything was ready. The Russian line looked weak. It looked disorganized. It looked like it was retreating. It looked like the easiest victory the knights would have in the entire campaign. And that was exactly the impression Nevsky wanted to create. On the other side, the Teutonic commanders smiled. They saw what they wanted to see. A fearful enemy, a vulnerable enemy, an enemy that would be crushed in minutes. And they gave the order Nevsky was waiting for. The order that would seal the fate of hundreds of knights. The order that would change the course of history. Charge. The formation began to move. 400 armored knights, thousands of men-at-arms behind them. The full weight of the Teutonic order bearing down on the ice. The sound was deafening. Hooves pounding on the frozen surface. Armor rattling. Commanders shouting orders. The roar of an army confident in its invincibility. And on the opposite bank, Alexander Nevsky watched, calm, motionless, waiting. Because he knew something the knights didn't. He knew that beneath that noise, beneath that confidence, beneath those thousands of kilos of metal and muscle and arrogance, the ice was starting to react, tiny cracks forming, pressure building, structure weakening, nature preparing to do what nature does when you defy its rules. The plan was working, the trap was closing. And in the coming hours, the world would discover what happens when you underestimate a Russian prince who turned the terrain itself into a weapon of annihilation. But before that, before the ice broke, before chaos took over, there was only that moment. That moment of absolute suspense. When everything is in motion but nothing has happened yet. When fate is being written but hasn't been revealed yet. When 400 knights are galloping toward destruction, but still believe they are galloping toward victory. That impossible moment between planning and execution. Between genius and catastrophe. Between life and death. And Alexander Nevsky, standing on the shores of Lake Peipus, knew this moment was about to end. The weight was accumulating. Every hoof striking the frozen surface of Lake Peipus transferred tons of force downward. Every armored knight added more pressure. 400 warriors clad in steel plates, thousands of men-at-arms behind them. Heavy horses, armored to the teeth. All that metal. All that momentum. All that pride. And underneath, invisible but inevitable, the ice was reacting. They didn't hear it yet. The noise of the charge was too deafening. The thunder of hooves, the clatter of armor, the shouts of commanders ordering tighter formations, full speed. The absolute confidence of an army that had never been defeated. The Teutonic knights galloped toward the retreating Russians, certain that this would be just another crushing victory. Another city conquered. Another frontier expanded. Another proof that the order was invincible. But Alexander Nevsky, standing on the opposite bank, could hear it, because he knew what to look for. That subtle sound, that specific vibration. The ice starting to give way, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, methodically, exactly as he had predicted. Microscopic cracks forming under the concentrated pressure. The crystalline structure, weakened by spring, being tested to the limit, and then beyond the limit. The first crack was almost imperceptible, a sharp, distant sound, lost in the roar of the charge. But the knights at the front felt it, strange vibrations traveling up through their horses' hooves. Some mounts began to hesitate, animal instincts sensing danger their riders ignored. Commanders shouted orders louder, hold formation, speed up, don't let the Russians escape, Prussian discipline overcame fear. The charge continued, and then the ice broke. It wasn't a total and instant collapse. It was something far more terrible. It started in the center, where the concentration of weight was greatest. A section of perhaps 10 meters simply gave way. Knights and horses plunged straight into the freezing water below. The shock was absolute. 1 second before, they were galloping on a solid surface. The next, they were submerged in icy water, fighting against the weight of their own armor. 30 kilos of steel plate, weapons, shields, all that equipment that made them invincible on dry land now turned into anchors, dragging them down, making movement impossible, turning elite warriors into helpless victims. The horses panicked, legs thrashing frantically, heads surfacing and submerging. The sound was terrifying, desperate whinnying mixed with the muffled screams of drowning men. And the worst was yet to come, because that first break created pressure waves through the remaining ice. Cracks propagated like frozen lightning, fracture lines running in all directions. Other sections began to give way. Then more, and more. What had been a solid battlefield was turning into a field of liquid death. Teutonic commanders tried to shout orders to retreat, but the formation was too tight. The momentum was too strong. Hundreds of knights were still pushing from behind, unable to see the disaster ahead. They continued advancing straight into the breaking sections, waves of warriors disappearing into the icy water, entire regiments being swallowed whole. The lake was literally devouring the Teutonic order. Alexander Nevsky raised his hand. It was the signal. From the hills surrounding the lake, where they had remained hidden throughout the entire trap, thousands of Russian soldiers emerged. Light cavalry, infantry, archers. They didn't run onto the ice. They didn't make the same mistake as the Teutonic knights. Instead, they remained on the solid banks, attacking the survivors trying to escape. The Teutonic knights who managed to pull themselves out of the water found themselves disoriented, soaked, hypothermic, and facing a fresh, positioned enemy. There was no formation, no discipline, only chaos and terror. The battle, if it could still be called that, lasted less than an hour. But for the Teutonic knights, every minute must have felt like an eternity. Warriors who had spent decades training, who had conquered entire territories, who considered themselves the military elite of Europe, were dying on a frozen lake because someone had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. 400 to 500 knights died that day. Many drowned, dragged to the bottom by the weight of their armor. Others froze in the water. Some managed to reach the bank only to be captured or killed by the Russian forces. The exact number would never be known. Many bodies remained under the ice, visible but inaccessible, a frozen reminder of the price of arrogance. The survivors fled in absolute disorder. There was no organized retreat, no preservation of banners or military honor. It was simply a desperate race away from that cursed lake. Alexander Nevsky didn't pursue them. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. The Teutonic Order had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that Russia would not be conquered easily. When the sun began to set over Lake Peipus on April 5, 1242, the frozen surface was strewn with bodies, broken equipment, and dark patches where the ice had given way. Alexander Nevsky walked along the shore, observing the results of his plan. His own losses had been minimal. A few soldiers wounded in skirmishes with the Teutonic survivors, but nothing compared to the devastation inflicted upon the enemy. The Novgorod Republic was safe, Russian territory was preserved, and more importantly, the Teutonic expansion to the east had been halted so decisively that it would take decades to resume. But the impact of that battle went far beyond the numbers of dead or territories preserved. The Battle of Lake Peipus became a symbol, a turning point not just militarily, but civilizationally. The Baltic Crusades, that systematic movement of German Catholic expansion through the Orthodox and pagan territories of the East, lost its momentum against Russia. The Teutonic Knights would continue to exist for centuries, would continue to conquer other lands, but they would never again advance deep into Russian territory with the same arrogant confidence. Nevsky had demonstrated that technological superiority, heavy armor, and an intimidating reputation meant nothing if the enemy commander understood the terrain better than you did. The Novgorod Republic not only survived but thrived. Alexander Nevsky became a living legend. He would be remembered not just as a prince or military leader, but as the strategist who saved Russian Orthodox civilization from Western Catholic absorption. His canonization as a saint by the Orthodox Church decades after his death only solidified his status. But even in the purely military realm, his legacy was immense. The Battle of Lake Peipus came to be studied in military academies as a perfect example of how to transform the environment into a weapon, how to use the enemy's psychology against them, how to win without depending on superior numbers or advanced technology. And the message of the battle echoed through the centuries. It established a boundary that was far more than just geographic. It was civilizational. Germanic influence hit a wall on the shores of Lake Peipus. The Slavic Orthodox world preserved its independence from Germanic Catholic expansion. It would be too neat to pin centuries of European history to a single battle. Yet there's no denying that April 5, 1242, changed the power dynamics of Eastern Europe. It set a precedent. It proved Russia wouldn't be easily conquered or absorbed. And it sparked the formation of a Russian national identity, rooted in part in standing firm against Western pressure. In the days following the battle, as the ice melted completely with the advance of spring, more bodies surfaced. Armor corroding in the water. Banners of the Teutonic order sinking into the silt. Lake Peipus had become a tomb. And for generations, local fishermen would share tales about how, under certain conditions, you could still see dark shapes beneath the surface, ghosts of knights who wagered everything on their invincibility, and lost it all to a Russian prince who understood something fundamental. Sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a sword or a spear, but knowledge. Knowledge of the terrain. Knowledge of weather patterns. Knowledge of how to weaponize the forces of nature itself. This is the timeless lesson. Tactical innovation beats brute force. Strategic intelligence trumps technological superiority. A commander who truly masters their environment, who understands conditions, who breaks conventional military thinking. That commander holds an advantage no amount of armor can overcome. Alexander Nevsky didn't have cannons. He didn't have superior numbers. He didn't have fancier equipment. What he had was mastery of his terrain. And on April 5, 1242, that mastery was enough to destroy the most feared military force in Europe. Lake Peipus is peaceful today. Fishermen work its waters. Tourists visit its shores. But if you know the history, if you know what happened on that spring day over 780 years ago, you will look at that surface differently. You won't just see water, but the stage for one of medieval history's most brilliant tactical victories. A reminder that sometimes, the greatest triumphs come not from strength, but from wisdom. Not from weapons, but from understanding. Not from what you carry, but from what you know. What other battles turned environmental factors into decisive weapons? Share your stories in the comments. And if you want more tales of tactical genius changing the course of history, subscribe to the channel. Because there are dozens of moments like this, where brilliant commanders used creativity and intelligence to defeat seemingly invincible enemies. And each one of them deserves to be told. Remember, sometimes the greatest weapon isn't what you carry, it's what you're standing on.